Hello everyone! So this is the second attempt at putting a review of Hamilton up online. I did a live stream of it to Instagram and then pressed the wrong button and it disappeared. So this will be pre-recorded and I will repeat. You'll get an even better performance from me because that one was a rough draft. It being so late at night, people didn't see it, tune into it live anyway. So it was just me speaking to the ether about the merits of Hamilton. So yeah, I saw Hamilton and on Disney Plus, and it was exciting for me because I've been a fan of the soundtrack for a very long time. And it definitely strikes me as something that, much like Jesus Christ Superstar going up around Easter, Hamilton going up around 4th of July, probably a conscious decision on Disney's part to do that. And I'm a huge fan of musicals. When I was posting something around 10 to my Instagram to tell people that later I wouldn't be posting my usual 10 o'clock Esther shift check-in, but I would be posting my Hamilton review later. I used a picture of me going to an event where they were doing Les Miserables, and they were doing it with it was like a whole parody that they were doing for Purim. It was a really cool event, but yeah, for Instagram you have to put up an image or a video, so I used that. So revolution, a musical about a revolution happening in the same century, and similar outfit, I suppose. This is my little tricorn. This is my little nod right now, but otherwise not dressed too terribly on theme. That it does tie in a lot to looking at Les Mis and looking at Hamilton and what things they had in common. As far as French content, other than the reference to Lafayette fighting in the American Revolution and Thomas Jefferson coming from having been in France and not fought in our Revolutionary War, they have a quick line as well about how now in France they were fighting the war. So similar timelines, not identical, similar struggles against class yeah, like, however, where it comes down to the difference in a play like Les Mis and a play like Hamilton is that in Les Mis we know it's set in a historical context, but it's completely fictional characters, whereas Hamilton is based on historical characters in a historical context. And Lin-Manuel did an amazing job of showing how he was still putting an artistic spin on things. And in fact, one of the things I didn't know from just hearing the soundtrack and being obsessed with that is that they do some recasting, and they do that in the intermission. So on the Disney Plus version that they just put up, they have a 1-minute intermission where they have a countdown on an hourglass. I imagine, having been to plays, that it was much longer than 1 minute for the audience to go use the restroom and see if there's snacks in the lobby they want. But they use that to shift some roles. People who had a lot of them was like people who had died or just not been as relevant in the play. They recast them, which, as a former actor, it's kind of nice to not just like have your character killed off and then you disappear for the rest of the play. So from the French side, they did that. They took the actor who played Lafayette, and then in the second part of the play, he was playing Thomas Jefferson, who hadn't been in the play, and they make a big deal about how he's showing up now, and people kind of resent that he didn't fight in the war, but he's going into politics. So, or you have, I would say spoilers, but a lot of this would be American history. So you have, oh no, it's leaving my brain. I might have to look this up. The character that played his son, Philip, and who he played before that. Oh gosh, it's a really important historical figure who I don't know enough about either. that gets into part of my embarrassment on seeing these things. It gets me interested in history, but it reminds me how much I don't know about history, and it prompts me to look things up. I will get into sort of the idea behind maybe a pitfall of doing a musical or a story based on history when people expect it to be a absolutely 100% accurate. It's like the difference between a documentary and a biopic is you might take some liberties with a biopic. And so when it comes to Hamilton, I know a lot of people focus on the fact that it's telling the stories of a lot of white guys, well played by people of color. And I think that that was a really great choice on his part to really say, that he was telling it with fresh voices and fresh perspective. There's a lot that's being written and said about that particular topic, so I'll defer to some of the other sources on that. But I think that probably one of the things that struck me the most as far as filling in the gaps was that we talk a lot about history was written by the winners, and that is absolutely true. But when it comes to Hamilton, it's a good example of history was written by the writers. He was a person who did a lot of prolific writing, and we have his letters to go off of. And I love the idea that Lin-Manuel Miranda, who had this Tony Award winning musical In the Heights, is this musical theater nerd who just fell in love with the biography of Alexander Hamilton and decided to turn it into a musical that became a sensation. So I just love that, like, he used this nerddom about history and, like, translate into musical theater. They did some really amazing stuff. Gosh, I'm not great at multitasking. They did some really amazing stuff as far as like what they did with not just recasting, but something I knew already from the soundtrack, which is playing with timelines. So the Schuyler sisters, Angelic, I won't sing it because it's, I don't want to get sued, but although I guess that's more of a live stream thing and this is now pre-recorded. But yes, so his sister and two sister-in-laws were real people, and they wrote letters, and we base a lot of what we know on those letters. Mostly what we know from Alexander Hamilton's letters. But I loved how they played with time. So the night where Angelica Schuyler and Eliza Schuyler and Hamilton met, they show it from the viewpoint of Eliza, who he would go on to marry. And then at the wedding, as Angelica is giving a toast as a maid of honor for her sister, she even sings the words rewind, and it goes back and shows her recollection of that night and her disappointment that she didn't get to marry him. I feel like they might have like made this huge romantic comedy perspective just out of a few lines taken from letters. Like she did have an actual joke in a letter to her sister of like, if you loved me, you'd share him. But they had a lot of evidence that the two were very close. And I think that people just sort of aren't entirely sure if he and the sister-in-law had some romantic thoughts towards each other. Certainly, one thing I noticed from the soundtrack that I'd listened to and from this stage version on Disney Plus is they had made some changes to the story of just slight subtle changes to the situation with Mrs. Reynolds, Mr. and Mrs. Reynolds, and that, again, this is just a spoiler for history about him having sex with Mr. Reynolds' wife and then being blackmailed about it by Mr. Reynolds, and then having political opponents try to use it against him, and he just got kind of paranoid and didn't trust them. They said they wouldn't use it, and so he went and he just released the Reynolds pamphlet, and some people call it America's first sex scandal. And they show again a really great reference to history being written by the writers. There's this great song called Burn, and it's speculating that Hamilton's wife Eliza found out about his affair from the Reynolds pamphlet that her husband publicly published to tell this scandalous details. And they reference in that song that history won't get to know what she said or how she reacted, and that she's going to burn her response or burn the letters that he gave her. So that's an interesting choice for Lin-Manuel to make about the absence of information, and because history might want to know how someone would react to finding out that their husband cheated on them. And did she know before he released the Reynolds papers, or did he just do it? It mentions the fallout of that is he's now sleeping in his office. So it's similarly like him sleeping with Mrs. Reynolds. I think the original soundtrack definitely made it seem like she was in on it. This woman tempted him away and convinced him to commit adultery, and then it was a plot by her and her husband to try to extort money out of Hamilton. And that's what we're getting from Hamilton's side of things. And we also do have the letters that Mr. Reynolds wrote, but there's a lot of speculation about what Mrs. Reynolds' role in this was. And so I feel like they made a slight change, at least in the song. And again, I might just be going off memory and misremembering that, but I know he'd gotten a lot of flack for the way he originally wrote that music. So now it seems like a sense of there's where Mrs. Reynolds is standing by the thing that she didn't know what her husband knew. She didn't know that the husband found out about the affair or tried to extort money out of him. And she's also a victim in this, whereas Hamilton still doesn't believe her and thinks that she's making it up and she's in with her husband. We really don't know. All these people are dead now. We're basing it on letters. And so the sense from the previous version of that song was very strongly implying, hey, Mrs. Reynolds, she conspired to do this. Whereas now they're leaving it a bit more up in the air about whether she was in on the whole thing. In fact, they kind of made a good point about how he had... she came to him to say that her husband was abusive and a bad guy. So it became, again, what she said to him when Hamilton confronted her. Like, no, I didn't know my husband did this. This is more evidence that he's a bad guy. Very kind of disturbing because she uses the term helpless, which is like already like, okay, why is Hamilton even going to sleep with this girl who's saying my husband's an abuser? But that is a callback to Hamilton's wife when she first meets him and how she's in love with him and she feels helpless because of her loving feelings for him. And it's sort of like, do you have a type, Hamilton? Are you just very attracted to this someone who has that type of emotional reaction to you? And I mean, we all kind of fall into that trap of maybe wanting to rescue people, and there's certainly an amount of friendship and kindness that comes out of the fact that sometimes people are vulnerable and need our help. Turning those into like romantic or sexual relationships, especially when you're getting into adultery, that's when you're getting into some pretty shady territory there. So I can see why the play had some pressure to maybe change the way that they portray Mrs. Reynolds. It's also the only time that I think they even used a completely different actress than what was on the original recording. And so I preferred this. I felt like it was better to keep it a bit more ambiguous. I don't know. These people are all dead. I don't know. Maybe she was in on it. Maybe she wasn't. But I don't think that a play should take a really strong stance on this is a horrible, it's hard because this is not history. It's basically biopic. So they're still taking liberties and there's still a lot we don't know. In a lot of ways, Hamilton writing so many letters and writing the Reynolds pamphlet to tell his side of the affair, or writing so much of the Federalist Papers, and it's almost like he was like writing his autobiography ahead of time and just like telling things from his point of view. And I kept thinking he really needs an editor, because me as a writer, I think about like NaNoWriMo, that November, and you like trying to write a whole book in 1 month. I'm like, every month was NaNoWriMo for Alexander Hamilton, and he needed an editor. And it turned out that after he dies, at least from the solo that we have from Eliza, is she goes through his thousands and thousands of letters. And so I was like, oh, you married an editor. Okay. I probably shouldn't have cheated on her. So it's just such a great idea that Lin-Manuel would read this biography and be inspired to make this play. I am continuing to fail. Let's see, let's go to IMDb. Hamilton. That's not something from the play, that's just me singing myself because I do that an awful lot. I had a friend who wasn't entirely jazzed. He wasn't as obsessed with the soundtrack as me, and this was kind of his first foray into watching Hamilton. He wow, this is 160. It was much more. It was, oh, I guess that would be 2 hours and 40. Gosh, math when I'm trying to multitask. Let's get into cast. I am glad this is more accessible. Having Amazon, I could read the soundtrack, but it's so difficult to get tickets to Hamilton. To have this finally be out. I did on my YouTube, and not yet on Instagram, did a vibe check on Disney, so some of my critiques of Disney in general, but I'm glad that they brought this to the masses. Let's see. I just want to know some things. Jonathan, there's that guy. I got into it from seeing this great performance locally in Seattle where someone was doing a drag king version of You'll Be Back by King George in Hamilton. And also it was a duo act, and the other person was pretending to be Captain America, and it was hilarious and great, and I had no idea where that song was from. So afterwards I asked them where it was from, and that's how I went home and I went, the soundtrack is all on the Amazon, and I could just listen to it over and over. It's very dense information wise, exposition historically, so I could see it sort of overwhelming someone. As far as why I'm now remembering, I just brought up a friend. He really didn't know much about Lin-Manuel about this, didn't know that he'd done In the Heights, and then I was like, he did Moana, and my friend didn't know that, and he actually does like Moana. He didn't happen to like Hamilton. It's just I took offense because he called Lin-Manuel a rapper, and I'm like, that's not all he is. He's a brilliant singer and song composer, and created this show, and it's more hip-hop than rap anyway. There's a lot of similarities, but they're definitely different. But my friend was saying it wasn't his cup of tea, and I was like, that's okay. Around then, a lot of people just sliced the good tea and threw it in the ocean, so it's fine. My friends don't have to like the same things as me. But IMDb has finally given me the information, which is, yes, John Lawrence. The whole thing I was talking about, because when I first brought this up, I was talking about how Thomas Jefferson, he was previously played by the guy who plays Lafayette. So they also did in the intermission, John Lawrence, who dies, and then he ends up playing Philip Hamilton, Hamilton's oldest son, who also dies. So that is someone I would love to like dip into history and learn more about, Lawrence, because it sounds like he was fighting not just in the Revolutionary War, but also trying to say, hey, there's slavery and there's still a lot of racism with black people, and I want to still talk about that and bring that up, and it's very, very important because both black and white people are fighting in the Revolutionary War. And so he was a character who definitely could have really sparked me to do even more research. And then some of the critiques of Hamilton have been that maybe Lin-Manuel has glossed over the fact that a lot of these people were slave owners, and maybe they weren't as woke as they appear. Again, though, this is a retelling. This is a biopic and not historical, but I can see where there's some merit to some of those critiques. They do like an amazing like rap battle version of Cabinet Meetings, which again is like historically, like this is very Schoolhouse Rock, like making you want to learn stuff with great music and rhymes. And it's very like, he throws it in Thomas Jefferson's face that the reason the South is doing well is because they don't pay for they don't pay for labor. So it's like him trying to call out. But yeah, Hamilton himself does not have his hands clean there. So it's just kind of like, I don't know. It's such a great play because it encompasses all these things. It's not perfect, but it's also not a historical book. It's a musical. And then as far as Disney bringing this, I don't know if it's because Lin-Manuel has his connections from Moana. It is in general, yeah, Moana. I could go and talk at length about that as well. Really well done. And some of the YouTube people that I think do really good video essays, one of them is Lindsay Ellis, and she's comparing like Moana to Pocahontas. And I did talk, I think, at Columbus Day last year, and not liking Columbus Day, but loving that places like where I'm at, Seattle, have reclaimed the day and called it Indigenous Peoples Day, because Columbus, awful person, and us learning, you know, in 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue, but like not hearing the rest of the story in school. That a horrible murder and terrible things happen after that, and he's not a good person, and he also was extremely stupid because he landed here and instantly thought he was in India. So yikes. But I think what I was talking about then was my feelings about the Disney movie Pocahontas, and it's a lot of what I would look at with Hamilton, which is, even as a kid, I knew that the way that Pocahontas was portrayed was not accurate. Like, I still didn't even in school have an accurate sense of the story of Pocahontas. I've learned more about it as an adult. But even Disney, I was like, you sure are romanticizing a thing that probably was not romantic in the slightest. Yeah. So, but that's meant for kids, so it's a little bit hard, I think. Like, Disney takes a lot of liberties with fiction, fairy tales, and telling them differently and maybe in messed up ways. But when you take history and you're showing it to kids, you're like, hey kids, this is the story of Pocahontas, and like, it's not good. I mean, everything has good parts, yeah, but I just really hated that blurring of the lines. So Hamilton, don't think it was geared towards children. There's a lot of profanity. Well, there was violence, at least in the staging that we saw. Watching with my aunt, she noticed they don't have blood. Like, they did a really good job of showing death and injury, but they didn't use like effects to show blood splatter or anything. It's an interesting choice. I like how things are staged and the choices they make, but yeah, I think we just have to be very mindful of having our brains be able to sort things as history versus biopic versus a complete fiction. And so, yeah, I guess that was kind of my only point there to bring up, is that, like, just make sure. Gosh, I just got into this. So I mentioned Lindsay Ellis doing the Pocahontas versus Moana. I just got into something called Pitch Meeting that's through Screen Rant, and they had me rethinking Bohemian Rhapsody. So it's just a comedic thing, and it's talking about the way movies might have been pitched, completely fictionalized, but kind of exposing plot holes. And I did a review of Bohemian Rhapsody after seeing it on my Facebook or on my YouTube, and I was hoodwinked because as I'm watching Pitch Meeting, I found out they made up a lot of stuff. They just did a lot of Queen music, and then they made up things. In fact, they did things the opposite of what actually happened in history. And I was fooled by this biopic. It would be a great movie if it were about a fictional person and not a real person. And it is a great movie. It's just, I would love that disclaimer on the whole thing of like, this is a biopic that's pretty much just fanfic about Freddie Mercury. So I think that's just what we have to be mindful of, is that whenever we're watching. I'm a time travel author, and so I've had to explain to people I'm not doing a history textbook, but I still try to do my research and make sure I'm not completely like saying things that didn't happen. I'm speculating about what meeting historical figures might have been like, but I'm trying not to like put full misinformation out there. I have been examining this week too because I was thinking about getting into some more nonfiction print essays for a magazine, and I'm not there yet. I've learned a lot more about how I have to polish myself and present myself and do uh, how to find writing fellowships and freelance work. But I love doing this improvisational style of video essay. And when I tried to make a writing sample by taking 3 of my Little Mermaid rants and just take the YouTube auto transcribe and see, I was like, oh yeah, this is not what a print essay should look like. This is me just talking off the cuff. And so like it's I my hat is off to people who do like more of the research and try to present something that's just as factual as they possibly can, rather than me just commenting on videos and things I've seen and what I have looked into. So I was going to mention another thing if you like Hamilton. There's a Comedy Central show, and most of the clips are on YouTube. It's called Drunk History, and they did do a Lin-Manuel one where he was telling the story of Hamilton, and he was telling things that weren't included in the musical. Because again, Hamilton wrote many, 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 many letters, and I'm sure it was a very long biography. So I still couldn't fit everything in a 2 hour and 40-minute musical. So I learned some more stuff from that. That one, instead of just twisting, using not just white people, it was also doing some gender swaps, which was really interesting, and just learning a bit more there. And and actually, if you don't know anything about drug history, that does involve an improvisational style of nonfiction information. And as a weird quirk, the host is inebriated, and the person they're interviewing is inebriated. And the person they're interviewing is really like a history geek about a very specific story. And so they will tell that story, and they will also get a bunch of actors, mostly comedy actors, to put on costumes and reenact these things while noticing that people will get some things wrong because they are drunk. I think it's a little bit clearer, I think, in those cases that you're getting information, but also if you want to like do a history paper, maybe go read the source. So I hope. I'll admit I'll watch Drunk History and I'll say that was a really interesting story and not go dig any further. But if there's something that I actually wanted to turn a report in on, or report on in a more nonfiction way, I would hope for myself that the college student in me would go try to find the sources, and put up links. So I hope that everybody's enjoying whatever 4th of July means to you. I am putting this up past midnight. You're probably still hearing some fireworks here and there. I was going to try to keep my cats calm, but one cat, Tilly, just really enjoyed watching Hamilton with us. And then Pebbles is now asleep in the living room. She was not around for it, but she found the sounds of fireworks very interesting and perked up her ears, but she didn't seem overly like scared by it. That's always my concern, is I'm always worried that my animals are going to freak out because of fireworks.